The unlocked door. I don't know where to start. I've always been a careful person. Maybe too careful, if I'm honest. Living alone made me that way. It's been just me in my small house for the last 3 years. It's in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, but comfortable enough. I work a regular 9 to 5 job, have a few friends, and I'm pretty routine. I thought I was safe. About a month ago, I started noticing something strange. I'd wake up, get ready for work, and notice my front door was unlocked. At first, I figured I must have forgotten to lock it the night before. I mean, it's easy to overlook something when you're tired after a long day, right? But it kept happening. Day after day, I'd double-check the lock before bed, but by morning, the door would be unlocked again. I told myself it was just me being forgetful. Maybe I was stressed, distracted, but deep down, I knew something was off. I even joked to myself about it, like it was some quirky thing I was doing. Then, one morning, I found a glass of water on the kitchen counter that I didn't remember pouring. That's when I started to feel uneasy. That night, I came home from work feeling more on edge than usual. I locked the door, checked it twice, then settled in for the evening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I went to bed early, hoping to shake the paranoia, but when I woke up the next morning, the door was unlocked again. This time, I knew something wasn't right. I knew I locked it. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was someone coming into my house? No, it couldn't be. I would have noticed. But what if they were? What if someone had been here watching me sleep? I decided I needed proof. I went out that afternoon and bought a cheap hidden camera online. It wasn't anything fancy, just something I could set up in the living room, pointed at the door. It made me feel a little better, like I was taking control of the situation. That night, I set the camera up, locked the door, and went to bed. As I was drifting off, I thought I heard faint footsteps downstairs, but I convinced myself it was just the house settling. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I didn't even check the door right away. Instead, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just an empty living room, quiet and still. But then, around 2 a.m., the door handle started to turn, slowly. My heart dropped as I watched a man in dark clothes quietly slip into the house. He moved like he'd done it before, like he knew his way around. He didn't even hesitate. He walked around my living room, his steps slow, deliberate. He paused near the staircase, just out of sight of my bedroom. I was watching him in my house, while I was upstairs, completely unaware. After a few minutes, he walked back to the door, turned the handle, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, locking itself. I sat there, staring at the screen, frozen. It wasn't me. I hadn't forgotten to lock the door. He had a key. Someone had been in my house walking around while I slept. I called the police. They came over, checked the door, but found no signs of forced entry. There was nothing, no damage, no fingerprints. They asked me if I had a spare key hidden outside, but I didn't. I could tell they didn't believe me. One officer even suggested I might have let someone in and just didn't remember. But I knew the truth. Someone was coming into my house, and I had no idea how. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I barricaded the door with a chair, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Every creak, every tiny noise made me jump. I was constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. Finally, I decided to stay awake one night, camera ready to catch him in the act. Around 3 a.m., I heard the door handle turning again. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed downstairs. But when I got there, the door was locked. Everything was still. I stood there, listening to the silence, trying to calm my racing heart. The next morning, I checked the camera footage. I couldn't believe what I saw. The man didn't come through the door. He was already inside the house. He stood in the living room, staring at my bedroom door. Just staring. Then, slowly, he walked toward the camera. His face filled the screen, and just before he reached out to cover the lens, he smiled. The footage cut off. He knew I was watching. He wasn't afraid. He wanted me to see him. I packed a bag and left that night. I called the police again, but there was nothing they could do. No forced entry, no sign of him. I told them about the footage, but they didn't seem concerned. To them, it wasn't a crime if there was no evidence of breaking in. But how was he getting in? How was he watching me? I drove away from the house, feeling sick to my stomach. As I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed a car parked a few blocks down. A dark car I'd seen a few times before but never paid attention to. Now I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, watching me leave. I moved to a new apartment after that, far away from the house. I try to tell myself it's over, that I'm safe now, but the fear hasn't gone away. Every night I check the locks over and over again. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of the door handle turning. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about a man arrested for breaking into homes in my old neighborhood. I held my breath as they showed his face, but it wasn't him. It wasn't the man I saw in the footage. To this day, I don't know who he was, how he got in, or if he's still watching me. The shadow under the bed. I moved into a new apartment a few months ago after a tough breakup. It wasn't anything special, just a basic one-bedroom in an old building, but it was affordable and close enough to work. The walls were thin. I could hear my neighbors walking around and the pipes rattling whenever someone took a shower. It wasn't perfect, but I needed a fresh start, and it felt like a good place to reset my life. For the first few nights, things were fine. I unpacked, settled in, and started to get used to the quirks of the building. But then I started hearing this faint sound at night. At first, I thought it was just the pipes again, but it wasn't quite the same. It was like something was dragging, slowly and deliberately. It seemed to come from under my bed, but I convinced myself it was just the old building making noise. I shrugged it off and went to sleep, but there was something about it that disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. The next night, the sound came back, and this time it was harder to ignore. It was more persistent, and I could swear it was moving, like something being dragged across the floor beneath me. My heart started racing, and I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a neighbor moving furniture or an animal in the walls. But the thought that it was directly under my bed kept creeping into my mind. The next day, I called my friend over for a drink, trying to bring some normalcy back. I joked about the noise and we laughed it off, but I asked him to check under the bed just to be sure. He got down on his knees, lifted the bed skirt, and found nothing, just dust. We both laughed, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Even after my friend left, the thought of that dragging sound stuck with me. That night, after I had calmed down and convinced myself it was all in my head, the sound came back. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It felt like it was moving right beneath the mattress. I froze, unsure of what to do. I wanted to check again, but something inside me just wouldn't let me move. The noise seemed too real to ignore now. After a few nights of this, I was completely on edge. The sound became a part of my routine, like an unwelcome guest that wouldn't leave. Every night, the dragging sound would return, slow and deliberate, and every night, I would check under the bed and find nothing. I was barely sleeping, waking up drenched in sweat at 3 or 4 a.m., my mind racing with all sorts of possibilities. Was someone messing with me? Was there something hidden in the walls? It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I finally called the building manager, hoping for some logical explanation. Maybe it was old pipes, or something to do with the heating. But he dismissed me, saying the building was old and strange noises were normal. I wanted to believe him, but it didn't explain why the noise felt so specific, so close to me every night. I started to withdraw from everything. I couldn't focus at work, and I stopped talking to my friends. I was sleep deprived and paranoid, and no matter what I did, earplugs, playing music, the noise wouldn't stop. It was always there, haunting me. It was like something was toying with me, but I couldn't figure out what or why. One night, out of sheer desperation, I moved my bed across the room, thinking maybe it was something under the floor. But when I lay down, the dragging sound followed. It was right beneath me again, and this time it stopped suddenly, right under the bed. The silence that followed was even worse. I lay there, my heart pounding, terrified to move. Hours seemed to pass in that heavy, oppressive silence, and every small creak or groan from the building made me jump. Then, just as I started to calm down, there was a loud bang from under the bed, and the dragging noise started again, faster, more frantic this time. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and with trembling hands, I lifted the bed skirt. But there was nothing there, just the cold, empty floor. I sank back down on the bed, my mind racing between relief and terror. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was losing my mind. But as I tried to convince myself of that, the noise returned, louder than ever. And this time, I heard something else, scratching like nails dragging across the wood. Desperate for answers, I flipped the mattress, threw the sheets off, checked every corner of the room. But there was nothing. The scratching suddenly stopped, and I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard it again. This time, it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was so tired, so paranoid, I started questioning everything. The noise was a constant presence in my life, even during the day, though quieter. It was like a prisoner in my own home, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to leave. It felt like the apartment was holding me there, even though I knew that was ridiculous. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear wouldn't go away. I finally decided I had to get out. I packed my things, ready to leave for good. But that last night, the sound returned, louder than ever. This time I didn't check. I just sat on the floor, numb, waiting for the morning. Even now, as I sit in my new place, the memory of that sound still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear it again, faintly in the distance. And as I drove away from that apartment for the last time, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move under the window, just for a second, but it was enough. So, I'm not the kind of person who gets freaked out easily. I work from home, keep to myself, and after a pretty tough breakup, I'm just trying to live my life quietly. I live in a suburban neighborhood, nothing special. It's quiet, and that's how I like it. But for the last few weeks, something's been bothering me. There's this car, a black sedan. It's been parked across the street from my house almost every day. At first, I thought it belonged to one of my neighbors or a visitor, but after a while, I noticed it never seemed to leave. Every day, it's there, in the same spot. No one ever gets in or out. It's just there. I don't know why, but it started to bug me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but then it hit me. I've never actually seen the driver. One day, I finally decided to check it out. It felt stupid, but my curiosity got the best of me. As I walked up to the car, it suddenly pulled away. Fast. Like whoever was inside knew I was coming. That shook me a bit. It felt deliberate, and that's when things got weird. After that, I started paying more attention. I couldn't help it. The car was there every time I was home, and it always seemed to leave the moment I got close. It was like someone was watching me. My work started to suffer because I'd keep checking the window, expecting to see it. I talked to one of my neighbors about it, but they just shrugged it off. Probably nothing, they said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something. Then, one night, I saw it again. This time, I was sure there was someone sitting in the driver's seat. They weren't moving, just sitting there, facing my house. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would someone park outside my house like that? And why were they watching? After that, things got worse. It wasn't just that the car was parked across the street anymore. Now, whenever I went out, whether for groceries or a walk, I'd see the car somewhere. Sometimes it was parked a few blocks away, sometimes further down the street, but it was always there. It followed me. I'd try to convince myself it was a coincidence, but it didn't feel that way. The feeling of being watched never went away. I decided to report it to the police. The officer I spoke to seemed skeptical, but I didn't know what else to do. A few days later, they called me back. They said the car was registered to someone in a nearby town, but there wasn't anything suspicious. Nothing they could do since no crime had been committed. That didn't help. If anything, it made me feel more helpless. I started to lose sleep. The car was always there, and every time I got close, it would drive away. I didn't know what to do. So, I installed a camera by my front door, hoping to catch something on video. But every time I checked the footage, it was the same thing. The car sitting there motionless. No one ever got out, but it still left whenever I approached. Then, one night, I checked the footage again. I don't know what I expected to find, but what I saw made my stomach drop. There was someone standing near the car, just outside, facing my house. They stood there for a few minutes before getting back into the car and driving off. That was the last straw. I couldn't take it anymore. One night when the car was back again, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. I was done being scared. My heart was pounding as I approached the car, but as soon as I got close, it sped off, faster than ever before. I didn't get a good look at the driver, but I knew they were watching me. I went back inside, shaken, but I couldn't rest. A few hours later, I heard something outside again. I looked out the window, and there it was, the car. This time, it was parked even closer, almost right in front of my house. The engine was running, but the headlights were off. I could barely make out the figure inside. I panicked. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but just as I did, the car took off. The police came a few minutes later, but of course there was nothing to find. I explained everything, but without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The officer tried to reassure me, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. After they left, I checked the camera footage again. What I saw made my skin crawl. The figure had gotten out of the car, walked up to my house, and stood at my front door for several minutes. They didn't knock, didn't try to break in. They just stood there, watching. Then they left. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I broke my lease and moved to a different part of town. For a while, things were quiet. I started to relax, thinking maybe I was free of it. But a few weeks later, on my way home from work, I saw it again. The same black car, parked just a few streets over from my new place. I don't know what to do anymore. The car is still out there. I've tried to ignore it, but the fear is always there. I don't know if I'm being targeted or if this is just some horrible coincidence. It's driving me insane. Has anyone else ever dealt with something like this? Any advice would help because I'm starting to think this is never going to end. I live alone in a small house, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I'm in my mid-30s and work from home, which suits me just fine. I used to love the peace and quiet. No loud neighbors, no busy streets. Just me, my job, and my little space. I order most things online: groceries, books, small decorations. So having packages show up at my door wasn't unusual. It was part of my routine. But lately, something's been off. I've been hearing strange noises at night: footsteps, a faint murmur, or maybe just the wind. It's probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe the neighbors or an animal passing by. Still, it's unsettling. I even found my mailbox slightly open a few times, though I always close it. Then, I got the first package. It was small and plain, no return address. At first, I didn't think much of it. I opened it to find a simple charm bracelet. No note, no explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone sent it to the wrong address. I considered returning it, but where? There was no way to trace it back. I let it sit on my kitchen counter, ignored. A few days later, another package appeared. This time, it wasn't random. Inside was my favorite brand of tea, something I never told anyone. My heart raced. Was it from a friend? A family member? I called around, but no one admitted to sending it. Everyone laughed it off, telling me it was probably some secret admirer. But that creeping feeling came back, stronger this time. Then came the third package. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a mistake, and it definitely wasn't a joke. It contained a photograph. It was of me, standing in my front yard, taken from the street at night. I was terrified. I immediately checked my locks: front door, back door, windows, all secure. I installed a security camera at my front door the very next day, hoping to catch whoever was leaving these packages. I stopped going out after dark. I double-checked every door and window before going to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every little sound, creaking floors, wind rattling the windows, made me jump. Then, the next package arrived. This time, it wasn't a gift. It was a USB stick. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop. The contents were a collection of video clips, footage of me. At first, they were innocent: me making coffee, me sitting on the couch, me on my laptop. But the angles, they were all from inside my house. Someone had been filming me. I felt sick. These videos were recent, only a few days old. I tore through my house searching for hidden cameras, checking every corner, every nook. But I found nothing. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I called the police, but without a clear threat or suspect, they brushed me off. No one's been hurt, they said. It's probably just a prank. A prank? Who does this for fun? I felt helpless. Desperate, I called a security company and had more cameras installed, inside and out. But it didn't help. That feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every night I lay in bed, wide awake, waiting for the next sound, the next package. A week later, I received the final package. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. Inside, there was a small, high-tech camera, the exact kind used to film me. I was losing it. I could hardly eat, barely sleep. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to think rationally, but how could I? Someone had been inside my home filming me, watching me. I became paranoid, staying up all night, staring at the security feeds. I heard footsteps outside my door, the floor creaking like someone was walking through my living room. But when I checked the cameras, there was nothing. Then, one night, I saw it. I was reviewing the footage from my new cameras. In the living room feed, there was a figure, a man, walking across the room while I was asleep on the couch. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see him. He was there, and then he was gone. No trace. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and locked myself in my bedroom. I sat on the floor, shaking, clutching my phone, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. I called the police again, but when they arrived, there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. They left me with half-hearted reassurances. and I was alone again. For days, nothing happened. No more packages, no more videos. The house was silent. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whoever it was had moved on. I started sleeping again, though fitfully, always with a knife by my bed. But the fear never left me. I still felt watched. Every time I went outside, I scanned the street, looking for anyone lingering too long. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. Then, today, I got a notification from my security app. My stomach dropped. It was a photo. One of the new cameras had captured me, sitting at my computer, typing this exact post. I'm being watched. Right now. And I don't know what to do next. The wrong house. It started off like any normal day. I live alone in a small one-bedroom house just outside the city. It's quiet here, peaceful even. Most of the neighbors keep to themselves, and I work from home, so the days blend into each other. My mornings are always the same. Make coffee, sit at my desk, and answer emails. I like the routine. It gives me comfort. But lately, a few things have been off. At first, I thought I was being forgetful, coming back from errands to find the back door unlocked, even though I was sure I locked it, or my keys missing from the hook where I always place them. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just distracted. Nothing too weird. Then last Thursday happened. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. These weren't the usual creaks you hear in an old house. They were heavy, deliberate. My heart started racing as I sat up in bed and listened. The sound stopped just as quickly as it began. I told myself it was just a dream. The next morning, though, the front door was wide open. That same night, I woke up again. This time, the noise was more distinct. Someone was moving around in my living room. Half asleep and irritated, I got up to check, hoping it was just something falling over. But when I walked into the living room, I froze. There was a man. He stood near the coffee table, his back turned to me. He wore a torn jacket and jeans, dirty like he'd been on the street for a while. My first thought was that he was homeless and had broken in for shelter. My stomach churned, and I felt a chill run through my body. I considered grabbing something to defend myself, but the man turned around before I could move. "I think I'm in the wrong house," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I didn't scream. I didn't run. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, and nodded. Yeah, I think you are." He didn't argue. He just walked to the door, opened it, and left. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. How did he get in? Why didn't he take anything? I convinced myself he was just confused, maybe drunk. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, things got weirder. I'd come back from a short walk and notice small changes. Nothing major, just little things like a chair slightly moved or the bathroom door left open when I knew I'd closed it. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I started locking all the doors obsessively, checking them 3 or 4 times before bed. Despite that, I'd wake up in the morning and find the front door unlocked again. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I didn't think that was possible, but what else could it be? Still, the feeling that someone was inside, watching me, wouldn't go away. Then, one night, the man came back. I was asleep when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway. This time, I stayed in bed, my heart racing as I tried to convince myself it was just another dream. But then I heard the bedroom door creak open. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at the dark outline of the door as it opened wider. Then, he stepped inside, He didn't say anything this time. He just stood at the foot of my bed, staring at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me frozen, him silently watching. But finally, I snapped out of it. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed, pushed past him, and ran out the front door, barefoot, not even caring where I was going. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, gasping for air. That was the last time I saw him. The next morning, I went to the police. Of course, I had nothing concrete to show them, no forced entry, no signs of a break-in, and I hadn't been harmed. Probably just some guy who thought he was at a friend's place, one of the officers said. They assured me they'd send someone to check the area, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. After all, nothing was stolen, and the guy didn't make any threats. Just a misunderstanding, they said. But I knew it wasn't over. The feeling of being watched never left me. I started staying up all night, keeping the lights on, scanning every shadow in the house. Every creak made me jump. Every little noise was a sign that he had come back. Then, a few nights later, I found something. It was small, almost insignificant at first glance, a crumpled piece of paper shoved into the corner of my closet. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a map, a hand-drawn map of my house. Every room was labeled, every door and window marked. And at the bottom, in shaky handwriting, was a note. I know where you sleep. That was it for me. I packed a bag and left, not even caring where I went. I just needed to get away. It's been a few weeks since I left. I haven't been back to that house, and I don't plan to. But the fear is still there. Every strange noise I hear makes me freeze, half expecting to see him standing there again, watching me. The police never found anything. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. To them, it's like it never happened. But I know it did. Every night I wonder if he's still out there, waiting. Maybe it was never about the house. Maybe it was about me. I've tried to move on, but it's impossible. The map, the note, they're burned into my memory. I keep thinking back to that first night when he said he was in the wrong house. But I don't believe him anymore. He knew exactly where he was, and I can't help but wonder if, one day, I'll wake up in another strange house, and he'll be there, waiting for me again. The mirror reflection. I'm not really one to post on Reddit, but I need to get this off my chest. It sounds crazy, but maybe someone here will understand. I'm a college student, living in a small apartment off campus. Between classes and a part-time job, I barely have time for myself. But I've always loved visiting thrift shops. There's something about old, used things that have a history behind them. A few months ago, I found a vintage mirror at this small thrift shop near my place. It wasn't anything special, just an old rectangular mirror with a thin crack in the corner and some scratches on the frame. It was cheap, and my bedroom wall was bare, so I bought it. When I brought it home, I mounted it on the wall opposite my bed. It was a little crooked, but I didn't mind. For some reason, though, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. The room looked wrong, like the light reflected strangely, or the angles seemed off. I figured it was just the crack in the mirror playing tricks on my eyes and brushed it off. At first, it was nothing. I'd catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, and sometimes it felt like I was seeing myself move when I wasn't, but I figured I was just tired. College, work, and lack of sleep can mess with your head, right? One night, though, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The closet door was closed, but in the reflection, it looked slightly open. I turned around, definitely closed. I stared at the mirror for a while, telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, it bothered me enough that I moved the mirror to the living room the next day. For a few days, everything seemed fine. The strange feeling went away, and I thought I had been overreacting. But then, I started noticing small things again. The reflection of the room didn't always match what was actually there. A window that should have been closed looked open. A chair was in the wrong place. One night, I woke up and saw something that nearly stopped my heart. A figure standing at the foot of my bed, just barely visible in the mirror. I snapped awake and looked around. Nothing. No one was there. But I could still see the shape in the mirror. That was when things started to spiral. I avoided the mirror after that, but no matter where I moved it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I'd pass by it and feel my skin prickle. My reflection looked normal, but off, like it was delayed. The worst part was that I started having nightmares. Terrible, vivid dreams where the reflections in the mirror came to life and trapped me on the other side. I'd wake up sweating, heart racing, convinced I was still stuck in the dream. I couldn't take it anymore. I started looking up stories about old mirrors, hoping for some logical explanation. I found articles about how certain types of old glass can distort light, making reflections seem strange. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It felt like there was something else going on. I started noticing that figure more often, standing in the background of the reflections, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. It never moved, but it was always there. One day, in a panic, I threw a sheet over the mirror. But when I looked, the reflection in the mirror was still moving under the sheet, like it was alive. I yanked the sheet off, but there was nothing, just the same cracked glass staring back at me. I knew it was crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the mirror was watching me. I didn't tell anyone, not even my roommates, because what could I say? That I was being haunted by my own reflection? The breaking point came late one night. I woke up to a faint noise, like glass shifting. It was coming from the mirror. I turned on the light and looked at it, and there I was, standing in the reflection. Except, it wasn't me. My reflection wasn't moving in time with me. It was delayed, watching me, like it was waiting for something. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, cold sweat on my skin. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a lamp, and swung it at the mirror as hard as I could. The mirror shattered, glass flying everywhere. For a moment, I stood there, breathing hard, thinking it was over. Relief washed over me. But as I stepped over the shards to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of something in the broken pieces. One shard still held a perfect reflection of the room, and in that reflection, the door was wide open. And there was someone, or something, standing just outside the frame, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I threw out every piece of broken glass and tossed the mirror into the dumpster the next morning. But the fear didn't go away. I started avoiding all reflective surfaces, windows, my phone screen, anything that could show my reflection. I haven't looked at myself in the mirror in days. I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm alone. A few days ago, I told my friend about everything. They listened, concerned, but brushed it off as stress or maybe a sleep disorder. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I know it's not that simple. The feeling of being watched is still there, lurking just out of sight. Last night, I caught my reflection in the window, and I swear I saw something move behind me just for a second. I'm trying to stay calm, but I don't think it's over. I've been thinking about getting therapy, but part of me wonders if it's already too late. I destroyed the mirror, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in it hasn't really gone away. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Or is it just me? I never thought something like this could happen to me. I live a pretty ordinary life. Nothing special. I work in an office, commute daily, and stick to a routine. Most days are the same. I wake up, grab coffee from the same spot, and take the same route to work. For a long time, that routine was comforting, predictable. But recently something changed. It started a few weeks ago. On my way home from work, I noticed someone staring at me across the street. It wasn't just a passing glance. It felt deliberate, like they were studying me. I brushed it off at first, thinking I was being paranoid. I'd never seen this guy before, and the city's full of weirdos, right? But it wasn't just one time. Over the next few days, I kept seeing him, always in the same place, always staring. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, but something about him made my skin crawl. One night, it got worse. I was walking home when the man stepped directly into my path. "Hey, I know you," he said, his voice firm but not shouting. I stopped, confused. "No, I don't think so," I replied, trying to keep moving, but he blocked my way again, this time looking me dead in the eyes. "Don't lie to me. I know who you are," he said, his tone darker now. I insisted that he must be mistaken, and after a few more tense moments, he finally let me pass. But something about the encounter left me rattled. The way he looked at me, it wasn't just recognition. It was more like he knew something about me, something I didn't know myself. I tried to shake it off, but my nerves were shot for the rest of the night. Then I saw him again. This time, I wasn't anywhere near my usual route. I was at a grocery store miles from my apartment. I was just grabbing a few things when I felt eyes on me. I turned, and there he was, standing in the next aisle, staring again. My heart raced, and I left the store without buying anything. From then on, it got worse. I'd see him everywhere, at work, outside my apartment, even at the coffee shop where I go every morning. He'd be sitting in the corner, just watching. Every time I tried to confront him, he'd disappear before I could reach him. I talked to the police about it, but they were useless. They said there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence of a threat. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," they said. My friends weren't much better. They told me to relax, that it was probably just some guy messing with me or a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, I came home from work, exhausted, hoping to forget the whole thing. But when I got to my apartment door, there was a note stuck to it. The handwriting was jagged, almost like it was scratched into the paper. "You can't hide from me forever." I stood there for a long time, staring at the note, feeling the walls close in on me. My hands shook as I fumbled to unlock the door. Inside, I locked every bolt, checked every window, and sat in the dark, my heart pounding. The paranoia was getting to me, but it wasn't just paranoia anymore. He was following me, and no one believed me. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't keep living like this. I went to the place I always saw him, the coffee shop. I waited until he showed up. Sure enough, there he was, sitting in the corner, his eyes locked on me like always. This time, I didn't run. I walked straight up to him. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, keeping my voice steady, even though my insides were shaking. He just smiled, a cold, thin smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You know why," he said. His voice was quiet, calm, but filled with something I couldn't place. Anger? Satisfaction? "I don't know you. I've never met you in my life." "Liar!" Before I could react, he grabbed my arm, pulling me close. His grip was so tight it hurt. "Stop pretending. I know what you did," he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. I struggled to break free, but he was strong, stronger than I expected. In the middle of the crowded shop, no one seemed to notice. It was as if the world had shrunk to just the two of us. I was gasping for air when I saw him reach into his jacket and pull out a knife. Time slowed down. I don't know how, but I managed to twist out of his grip and knock over the table between us. People started to notice the commotion, and I used the distraction to run. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. When I looked back, he was standing in the doorway, knife in hand, watching me with those same dead eyes. I should have gone to the police again, but what was the point? They didn't believe me the first time, and now I didn't even have the note anymore. So I locked myself in my apartment, scared to leave, scared to sleep. I tried to change my routine, avoided the places where I used to see him, even thought about moving to a different city. But it didn't matter. He was always there, somewhere, watching. The worst part is, I know it's not over. A few nights ago, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep when I heard it. A soft knock on my window. My heart stopped. I live on the 4th floor. There's no way anyone could be outside. But I know it's him. Somehow, he's found me again. And now, every night, I wait. Wait for the knock. Wait for the sound of him breaking in. How long can I keep running? I live in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much happens. It's the kind of place where people wave as they pass by, but no one really knows each other beyond that. I work from home, so my days are pretty predictable. I get up, go for a jog, cook my meals, and then settle into work. For a while, I didn't even know my neighbors. That is, until I met Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs is an older man who lives across the street. He's been there longer than I have, but we'd never spoken until about 6 months ago. One afternoon, I was getting my mail when he came over and introduced himself. He was friendly enough, maybe a little too eager to chat, but I figured he was just lonely. We talked for a few minutes and then I went back inside thinking nothing of it. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing him more often. Every time I went outside, he seemed to be there, waiting for a conversation. At first, it was fine. He'd ask how my day was, what I did for work, and I'd give him short, polite answers. But then he started asking more specific questions, like when I usually went for my jogs or if I ever had people over. I thought it was a bit strange, but I didn't want to be rude. One night, after a late grocery run, I came home to find my front door slightly open. I always lock it, so that freaked me out a little. Nothing inside was missing or out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the weeks went by, Mr. Jacobs' questions became more invasive. He'd ask about my schedule, when I'd be leaving the house, and once even asked if I ever traveled for work. His friendliness now felt intrusive, like he was trying to keep tabs on me. I started avoiding him as much as I could, but he was persistent. He'd show up unannounced, knocking on my door to ask for random favors, like borrowing sugar or needing help with his internet. The strange thing was, he'd always seem to catch me right when I was getting home or stepping outside. It felt like he was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, he started bringing up things I hadn't told him. One day, he mentioned that my car hadn't moved all weekend. Another time, he casually remarked that I got home late from jogging the previous night. I hadn't realized he was paying such close attention. The real turning point came one evening while I was watching TV. My phone rang and it was Mr. Jacobs. I hadn't given him my number, but I assumed he'd gotten it from someone in the neighborhood. He sounded calm, like it was just a casual call, but then he said, "You should be careful leaving your window open at night." I froze. The window he was talking about was in my bedroom, on the 2nd floor. There's no way he could have seen it from the street. My stomach dropped, and I muttered something about being more careful before hanging up. From that point on, I tried to cut off all contact with him. I stopped answering his calls, avoided him when I saw him outside, and changed my daily routine. But it didn't help. One day, while cleaning my house, I found a small, unfamiliar trinket under my couch. It was a cheap little thing, something I'd never owned. It didn't make sense how it got there. I installed extra locks on my doors, kept my blinds shut, and barely left the house unless I had to. But things kept getting worse. I started finding little signs that someone had been in my home. My keys would be in a different spot, or there'd be a glass on the counter that I hadn't used. Once there were muddy footprints near the back door. I finally confronted Mr. Jacobs in a roundabout way. I asked if he'd seen anyone strange in the neighborhood. He just smiled and said, "Don't worry, you're safe here." His smile sent chills down my spine. The feeling of being watched never left. I installed a camera at my front door, hoping it would ease my paranoia. But when I checked the footage a few nights later, I saw him, Mr. Jacobs, standing just outside my door. He didn't knock. He didn't try the handle. He just stood there, staring at the lock. It happened multiple nights in a row. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to move. I didn't tell anyone my plans, hoping that disappearing would be enough to get away from him. Then, one morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was an invitation to dinner at Mr. Jacobs' house. I didn't want to go, but a part of me felt like I had to, just to keep things calm until I moved. His house was eerily quiet when I stepped inside. He was overly polite, almost too calm, as he showed me to the dining room. My eyes wandered around the room, and that's when I noticed them. My things. A coffee mug I thought I'd lost, a scarf I hadn't seen in months. They were all here. Panic set in, but I stayed quiet. As I was getting ready to leave, he said casually, "I'm gonna miss seeing you around." I froze. He knew I was planning to move, even though I hadn't told anyone. I rushed home, locked every door and window, and tried to calm down. But that night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You looked beautiful tonight." The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, hoping to disappear for good. But even in my new apartment, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me. Every creak, every shadow feels like him. Yesterday I checked my mailbox. Among the usual letters was a small handwritten note with no return address. It said, "See you soon." Lost in the woods. I've always loved hiking. It's my way of escaping the city and clearing my head. My partner, Jane, and I have hiked together for years. We're no strangers to the trails around our state, and last weekend, we decided to try a new one in a forest we had visited before. This time, we picked a less traveled path, something that wasn't on the main maps but had been recommended by a few other hikers online. It sounded like an adventure, and we were both up for it. Everything felt normal when we set out. The weather was clear, though a bit cooler than expected, and the woods were peaceful. Jane seemed a little quieter than usual, but I figured she was just enjoying the solitude. As we were checking the map, I noticed something odd. A faint, faded trail branching off from the main one. I didn't remember seeing that path on the map the last time we were here, but I brushed it off. We decided to follow the trail anyway. We weren't in a rush, and the plan was just to explore. The deeper we went, the less defined the trail became. At first, it was kind of exciting, feeling like we were really getting away from the usual beaten path. But after an hour or so, the trees started closing in around us. The trail had almost completely disappeared beneath layers of leaves and fallen branches. Jane spoke up, saying she didn't feel good about continuing, that something felt off. I tried to reassure her, but truthfully, I was starting to feel it too. The air was heavy, and it was getting darker faster than I expected. That's when we realized we had lost the trail completely. I pulled out the map, and we tried to get our bearings, but nothing looked right. The trees seemed thicker, and the landmarks we'd passed earlier weren't anywhere in sight. Jane's voice cracked when she said, "We should turn back." I agreed, but as we tried to retrace our steps, nothing felt familiar. It was like the forest had shifted around us. That's when we heard it. Voices, faint but clear, somewhere in the distance. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound of people brought a sliver of hope. Jane wanted to follow the voices, thinking it might be other hikers who could help. We started walking toward the sound, but after a few minutes, it seemed to shift. No matter which direction we moved, the voices were always just out of reach. As we kept walking, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. footprints in the mud that weren't ours, odd markings on the trees like someone had been carving symbols into the bark. I tried not to think too much about it, focusing on finding the source of the voices, but Jane was on edge. We argued briefly about whether we should stop and wait or keep moving, but the voices had started getting louder, more insistent. They didn't sound friendly anymore. We pressed on, hoping to find some sort of sign, anything to lead us out. Then Jane gasped and pointed into the tree, swearing she saw someone watching us. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. "It's just your nerves," I said, trying to sound confident, but my heart was pounding. That's when we stumbled onto the campsite. It looked abandoned. There was a small fire pit with embers that were still warm. Someone had been here recently, but they were long gone. It didn't make sense. Who would leave a warm fire like that? Jane wanted to stay there until daylight, but I didn't feel safe stopping. It felt like whoever had been here was still close by, and I didn't want to wait around to find out who or what they were. Night fell fast, and the forest was pitch black. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. The voices had turned into shouting now, more like aggressive calls than conversation. It didn't make any sense. How could they be so close, yet we couldn't see anyone? Jane was on the verge of breaking down, and I wasn't far behind. We kept moving, but every sound made us jump. I heard twigs snapping behind us, like footsteps, and I turned around, shining my light into the trees. Nothing. But I knew something, or someone was there. Without thinking, I grabbed Jane's hand and we started running. The underbrush tore at our clothes and scratched our faces, but we didn't stop. Suddenly, Jane tripped, crashing to the ground. I nearly kept running, instinct taking over, but I stopped and pulled her up. We were both panting, too scared to speak. When we finally broke through the trees, I stopped dead. We were back at the campsite, the same one, the same fire pit, still warm. Panic set in. How was this possible? We had been running in a straight line, but somehow we ended up right back where we started. Jane was crying now, and I didn't know what to do. We were trapped. I felt like we were being toyed with. We huddled by the fire pit, both of us too exhausted to move. The forest was dead silent again, but the sense of being watched never left. I gripped a broken branch, my only makeshift weapon, while Jane leaned against me, trembling. Just when I thought we might make it through the night, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. The crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I stood up, my heart in my throat, but the steps stopped just outside the light of the fire. I strained my eyes, but I couldn't see anyone. We didn't sleep. The footsteps never returned, but we were too scared to close our eyes. When the sun finally rose, we wasted no time getting out of there. By some miracle, we found the main trail and followed it back to the parking lot. On our way out, we passed a group of rangers. I mentioned the voices we had heard, hoping for some kind of explanation, but they just exchanged glances and didn't say anything. One of them nodded slightly, but that was it. No explanation, no comfort. Even now, back at home, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there with us, watching, waiting. The babysitter's fear. I've never really been the type to share things online, but I can't stop thinking about what happened. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. Honestly, I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but here it goes. A few weeks ago, I took a babysitting job for a family I'd never worked for before. The parents were your typical professionals, in their late 30s, with 2 kids under 10. They needed me for the evening because they were going out for a company dinner. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of quiet that feels a little too heavy when you're alone. It's the type of silence that clings to you, making every little sound seem amplified. At first, the evening went by as expected. The kids were well behaved, and I had them in bed by 8 p.m. I settled on the couch with the TV on, trying to relax. But then, I started noticing small things, things I normally wouldn't pay attention to. A noise here, an object slightly out of place there. Nothing major, but enough to make me uneasy. It started with a faint sound coming from upstairs, like someone was moving around. I checked on the kids. They were both fast asleep. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or my nerves. But then, I went back downstairs and I noticed the remote. I was sure I'd left it beside me on the couch, but now it was sitting in the middle of the coffee table. It was a small thing, but it made me pause. I brushed it off, though. Maybe I moved it without realizing. Still, I couldn't shake this growing sense that I wasn't alone. Every time I glanced at the windows, it felt like someone might be watching from the dark yard beyond. My reflection in the glass seemed unnerving, almost taunting. Things got worse when I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. The back door, which I had locked when I arrived, was open, just slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I rushed to close it, locking it again, but the feeling of being watched only got stronger. By this point, I was on edge. I went through the house, checking all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. As I passed by the living room window, I thought I saw a shadow move in the yard. My heart was racing, and I froze, staring into the darkness, waiting to see if something would reveal itself. Nothing happened. The yard was still, almost unnaturally so. I told myself I was being paranoid, trying to calm down, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, this time coming from upstairs. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my hand trembling, and slowly made my way up the stairs. My breath was shallow, and I tried to stay quiet. The kids were still asleep when I checked their rooms. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the dread sitting in my chest. That's when I saw it. One of the closet doors was slightly open. I could have sworn it had been shut earlier. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to open it, but I also couldn't just leave it like that. Slowly, I walked over, raised the knife, and pulled the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. My relief was short-lived, though. From downstairs, I heard a loud thud, like something heavy had hit the floor. I bolted down the stairs, knife still in hand, only to find everything untouched. The living room was exactly how I'd left it, but I knew I hadn't imagined the sound. The parents weren't due back for another hour, and I didn't want to seem like the crazy babysitter, but I was convinced someone had been inside the house, or was still inside. Just as I was trying to figure out what to do, my phone buzzed with a text from the mom. "Is everything okay? We're heading back early." I quickly typed out a response, trying to sound calm, but before I could hit send, I heard the unmistakable sound of keys turning in the front door lock. My heart leapt into my throat. I hadn't heard a car pull up. The door creaked open slowly, and I stood frozen, ready to defend myself with the knife. But then I saw the father walk in, looking confused. He stared at me for a moment, taking in the sight of me standing there with a knife in my hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice casual, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I tried to explain about the noises, the open doors, the things that had moved on their own. He listened patiently, but as the words left my mouth, I realized how crazy it all sounded. I half expected him to laugh, but instead his expression grew uneasy. "I meant to tell you," he said slowly. "The house is under some minor renovations. The workers have been in and out all week, but they weren't supposed to be here today." I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't seen any workers, no signs of construction, nothing that would explain the noises or the open doors. Then he added, "They've been leaving the back gate unlocked sometimes. Maybe that's what you heard." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. It felt like he wasn't telling me everything. After that night, I never babysat for them again. I told myself it was because of the renovations, but deep down, I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the house that night, watching me. Every time I think about it, I still see that closet door, slightly ajar, like someone had just slipped inside. The worst part? I'll never know for sure. The family moved a few months later, and I lost contact with them. I still think about that night. I still wonder if I was just being paranoid, or if I got lucky. Even now, I can't explain what happened. The silence, the feeling of being watched, it still haunts me. I've moved on, but every time I'm alone at night, I find myself checking the locks, listening for the slightest sound. I wish I had answers, but maybe it's worse not knowing. Because sometimes, the scariest things aren't what we see, it's what we never get the chance to. The ride home. I've never really shared anything like this before, but after what happened to me, I feel like I have to. This isn't one of those supernatural stories or anything, but it's real, and it still haunts me. It was a regular Tuesday night. I work late at this small restaurant in the city, and by the time my shift ended, I was exhausted. Normally, I take the bus home, but it was raining lightly, and I just wanted to get home as fast as possible. So, I ordered a ride share. The streets were quiet, quieter than usual. It felt strange, but I brushed it off. As I waited, I noticed how heavy the air felt. You know how sometimes the weather just seems to carry a weird energy? It was like that. I opened the app to check my ride status, and the car was running late, 5 minutes to be exact. When it finally pulled up, something didn't feel right. The car didn't match the one in the app. It was the same color, but older, and I could have sworn the model wasn't right either. Still, I was tired and just wanted to get home, so I chalked it up to a mistake and got in. But I made a mental note to double-check the plate number later. The driver was a man, middle-aged maybe, with a cap pulled low and a mask covering his face. I get it. Some people are still cautious with masks, but it made it harder to get a good look at him. The car smelled weird, like stale cigarettes mixed with something metallic, and there was this awkward silence that filled the car. I tried to break it by making small talk, just asking how his night was going, but all I got was a grunt in return. That's when I started to feel uneasy. As we drove, I noticed he wasn't taking the usual route home. I asked about it, trying to stay casual, and he mumbled something about avoiding traffic. But the streets were empty. No traffic at all. That's when the unease turned into real anxiety. I checked my phone to text a friend, but there was no signal. That didn't make sense. I've never had issues with service in that area. I told myself it was just a dead spot and tried to calm down, but then he missed another turn. This one should have taken us closer to my neighborhood, and now we were heading toward the outskirts of the city. I asked again, this time more insistent, "Hey, you're going the wrong way." He didn't even look at me. He just turned up the radio. I could feel my heart starting to race, my hands shaking. I kept telling myself not to panic, that maybe I was overthinking it, but every part of me was screaming that something was wrong. I tried to open the rideshare app to report the situation, but it wouldn't load. I was stuck, alone, with no way to call for help. At the next red light, I thought about jumping out, but it was late, and there wasn't a soul around. I didn't know where I'd run to, and I didn't want to risk him chasing me. My mind was racing. I just needed to get out of this car. That's when I spotted it, a gas station up ahead. It was my only chance. I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "Can we stop here? I need to use the restroom." He didn't answer, but he pulled over, parking in the darkest corner of the lot, far from the station's entrance. That's when I knew I was in danger. As soon as the car stopped, I fumbled for the door handle and jumped out, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I ran toward the gas station, only to find it was closed. The lights were dim, and there wasn't a single car in sight. I felt panic rising up, swallowing me whole. I glanced back and saw him, just sitting there in the car, watching me. I was alone, completely isolated in the middle of nowhere with this guy. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I could hear my pulse in my ears, drowning out any rational thought. I ran behind the gas station, looking for a place to hide, but every corner felt like a dead end. That's when I heard it, the car door slamming shut. His footsteps were slow but steady, coming toward me. I had seconds to decide, hide or keep running. But where? In a desperate move, I darted behind a dumpster, crouching low, trying to hold my breath. My entire body was trembling. I could hear him getting closer, his shoes crunching on the gravel. I was sure he'd find me, and I didn't know what I'd do then. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a car engine approaching. A wave of hope surged through me. Without thinking, I ran toward the road, waving my arms like a madwoman. The car slowed down and stopped. I threw myself into the passenger seat, gasping for breath. The driver was a woman, middle-aged, with a concerned look on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked. I couldn't even form a complete sentence. "That guy, he wouldn't stop," I stammered. She nodded, not asking for details, and drove off. As we pulled away, I glanced back. The car wasn't following. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. My phone buzzed. It had a signal again. I opened the app to report the driver, but the ride wasn't there. It was like it had never happened. The car didn't exist. A few days later, I saw a news report. Several women had gone missing from the same area where I had jumped out. Their last known locations? All close to that same gas station. No one has seen or heard from them since. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible. I still replay it in my mind every night, unable to sleep. And just last night, I saw the same car again, parked on my street, idling for several minutes before driving away. The van in the parking lot. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I've been going over this in my head for days, and I don't know what to do anymore. I'm not even sure if I'm just being paranoid or if something is really happening. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but the way things have been going lately, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not safe. I'm just a regular guy. I work long shifts at a local retail store, mostly evenings. I'm used to the routine by now. Wake up, work, drive home. It's boring, but predictable. I park in the same spot every day, eat the same sandwich during my break, and drive the same route home. Nothing ever changes. But lately, something's been off. It started small, things you wouldn't even notice. A guy on the subway stared at me a little too long one morning. I got a couple of weird texts from a number I didn't recognize. But the most unsettling thing? There's this white van. I've seen it parked near my building almost every night for the past week, always in a different spot. At first, I didn't think much of it. There are a lot of vans in the neighborhood, but it's always there. Last night, though, was different. I finished my shift late as usual. The parking lot was mostly empty except for my car and that van. This time, it was parked right next to my car. The streetlights cast long shadows over it, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore it. It's just a van, right? But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The side door was slightly open, just a crack. And then I heard whispers. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to make me stop in my tracks. It sounded like 2, maybe 3 people inside, talking in low voices. My heart started racing. Were they talking about me? No, that's crazy. I must have been imagining it. I shook my head, telling myself it was just paranoia. After all, there were plenty of reasons why someone might be sitting in a van, right? Maybe they were waiting for someone. But as I reached my car, the door slid open a little more. The whisper stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, suddenly, I heard movement from inside the van. Before I could react, The door slammed shut. The noise echoed through the empty lot, and I panicked. I jumped into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting the van to follow me, but it didn't. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The van was always there, always in the background, like a shadow I couldn't escape. It started showing up everywhere, near my apartment, behind me on my commute, even at the grocery store when I stopped to pick up dinner. It never got too close, but it was always just within sight, lingering on the edge of my vision. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just someone who lived nearby. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I started noticing other things, small things. There was a scratch on my car door handle one morning, one I knew wasn't there before. Another day, I found the gas cap slightly open. Once, there was a smudge on the driver's side window, like someone had been leaning against it. I mentioned it to a friend, but they just laughed and said it was probably nothing. They didn't seem to get how weird it was. I started feeling like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining all of this? Was it just a coincidence, or was someone actually stalking me? I had to know. One night, I decided to stay late at work. I waited in my car, parked in the same spot, staring at the lot where the van usually sat. Hours went by, and I was about to give up when I saw it pull in. The van stopped at the edge of the lot and, like before, the side door slid open slightly. This time, though, I saw something I hadn't seen before. A hand reaching out from inside the van. It was holding something small and shiny. A camera. That's when it hit me. Someone inside the van had been watching me this whole time, filming me. Panic set in. I started the car and reversed out of the parking spot so fast I almost hit the curb. But as I pulled away, I heard the van's engine start. My heart raced as I glanced in the mirror. The van was following me. I sped through the empty streets, trying to lose them, but the van kept pace. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep control of the wheel. I turned onto a side street hoping to lose them, but my car suddenly stalled at a red light. In the silence, I heard the van pull up behind me. The side door opened slowly, and footsteps approached my car. I fumbled for my phone, trying to dial 911, but it slipped out of my hand and fell under the seat. The footsteps got closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up, and there he was, a figure, standing right next to my window, face hidden in the shadows. He raised his hand, about to knock, and then, just as quickly, he turned and walked back to the van. The door slammed shut and they drove off, leaving me sitting there completely stunned. When I got home that night, the van was gone. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I walked to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, but the street was empty. It had to be over, right? But when I got inside, locked the door, and checked my phone before bed, there was a new message from an unknown number. See you tomorrow. The next morning, I woke up in a cold sweat. No van. I told myself it was over. But that night, after my shift, I found a small piece of paper on my windshield. You can't hide forever. I stood there, frozen, scanning the darkness. The van wasn't there. But I know it's out there, waiting. I need to share something that's been haunting me for weeks now. It's one of those stories that feels unreal, but I swear, it's all true. I keep replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of it, but I just can't. Maybe sharing it here will help. So, my friends and I have this routine. Every month, we meet up, grab drinks, and unwind from life. It's a casual thing. Just bar hopping, talking, having fun. This one night, we decided to check out this new bar downtown. A little out of the way, but nothing crazy. Everything was normal, at least at first. Josh, one of my closest friends, seemed off. Usually, he's the life of the party, but that night he was quiet, distracted. He kept checking his phone and looking around like he was expecting something. I asked him about it and he just shrugged it off. Just work stuff, he said, though he wouldn't really explain. I didn't push him. I figured he'd open up when he was ready. As the night went on, we moved to another bar. That's when I noticed Josh talking to someone outside. This guy had his back to me, so I couldn't make out much. But Josh didn't seem comfortable. He looked tense, almost like he was trying to end the conversation. When we asked if he was coming, he waved us off and said he'd catch up. We didn't think much of it. That was the last time any of us saw him. The next day, none of us had heard from Josh. His phone went straight to voicemail. At first, we joked about it. Maybe he'd met someone and crashed at their place. But by the afternoon, we started to worry. Josh never ghosted us like that. We tried calling him, texting him, even checked his social media. Nothing. That's when it started to hit me. Something was wrong. I drove back to the bar, hoping someone had seen him. I asked the bartender and a few regulars if they remembered him, but no one did. It was like he disappeared into thin air after talking to that stranger. My gut told me something wasn't right. I tried to piece together everything I could remember from that night. His distracted behavior, the constant phone checking, the guy he was talking to. None of it added up. Hours passed, and I was sitting in my car, frustrated and scared, when I got a text. It was from Josh's number. My heart jumped, but when I opened it, it was just gibberish. Random letters and numbers that made no sense. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That text felt like a warning, though I didn't know what it meant. Days went by, and there was still no sign of Josh. We filed a missing person report, but the police didn't seem too concerned. These things happen, they said. He's probably fine. But I knew better. Something had happened to him. I couldn't shake the image of him talking to that guy outside the bar. I started going back there every night, hoping to see that stranger again. I became obsessed, spending hours parked outside, watching people come and go. It didn't take long for me to start noticing things. Cars parked outside my place for too long, phone calls where no one would speak on the other end. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the fear was real. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Josh's face, tense and nervous, glancing over his shoulder like he knew something was coming. One night, while I was parked outside the bar, I saw him, the stranger. He was walking down an alley nearby, the same one I'd seen him in before. My pulse spiked, and without thinking, I got out of the car and followed him. I kept my distance, trying not to lose him in the shadows, but as I got deeper into the alley, he vanished. I stopped, heart pounding, realizing I'd walked straight into a dead end. The air was thick with silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I turned around, ready to leave, when I heard it. Footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped. I spun around, but no one was there. The alley was empty, but the footsteps continued, growing closer. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as I was about to drive off, my phone buzzed. It was another text from Josh's number. This time, it was a photo. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of the alley I had just been in, taken from behind me. Someone had been watching me, and I hadn't even noticed. The timestamp showed it had been taken only moments before. I sped home, locking every door and window the moment I got inside. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every rustle outside felt like a threat. I posted here, hoping someone might have answers, but nothing anyone said made me feel any better. That was 3 days ago. Josh is still missing. No one has seen him, and the police have stopped looking. But I can't stop. I still hear those footsteps sometimes late at night, outside my house. They're soft, but they're there, circling, waiting. If you ever see someone watching you, don't look away. I wish I hadn't. Word count 1,000. The locked room. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. I needed to get away after a tough breakup, and the house seemed perfect. Quiet, isolated, just what I needed. It was an old place in a small, sleepy town. A little outdated, sure, but it had charm. The host had been friendly enough in their messages, and everything seemed normal at first. Except for one thing, the door. At the end of the hallway, there was a door that was locked. It had a small sign on it, "Off Limits." I didn't think much of it. Most places had storage rooms or areas that guests weren't allowed into, so I figured it was just that. Still, something about it felt wrong. It was too quiet in the house, like everything around me was muted. The first night, I settled in and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Just as I was dozing off, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old places creak. But then there was another sound, a soft tapping. It seemed to come from the direction of the locked door. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic sound. I sat up, listening. My heart started racing for no reason, but I told myself it was just the wind or something. Eventually, I managed to sleep. The next day, I messaged the host, just to ask about the door. The response was quick but dismissive. "Don't worry about that room. It's just old storage." The way they brushed it off made me uncomfortable, but I tried not to let it bother me. I went about my day, but every time I walked down the hall, I felt that door watching me. That night, the noises were louder. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. I could swear I heard footsteps behind the door, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt a weird kind of dread crawling over me. What was in there? I checked the door. It was still locked, but I swear I saw it shift, just a little. I backed away, my skin prickling with unease. I tried to ignore it, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I noticed something even more disturbing. The door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just barely enough that it shouldn't have been like that. I hadn't touched it. My first thought was that maybe the host had come in, but they hadn't mentioned anything about visiting the property. I quickly shut it, trying to calm myself down, but the anxiety was there, gnawing at me. Was someone else in the house? The sounds that night were worse than ever. There were whispers now, faint but unmistakable. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew they were coming from behind the door. My heart was racing again, and my body was tense. What the hell was going on in that room? Every time I heard something new, it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I messaged the host again, more insistent this time. I told them about the sounds, about the door being open. They replied with the same, almost robotic response. "It's nothing to worry about, just old pipes." Old pipes? No. This wasn't the sound of water or creaky wood. Something was in there. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I searched the house looking for any clue about what was behind that door. The smell near the door was strange, musty, like something had been sitting there for years. And on the floor, I saw faint scratch marks, like something heavy had been dragged. My mind started racing. What if the host was hiding something, or someone? That night, the whispers grew louder, and now there was a scratching sound like nails dragging against wood. I was losing it. My mind jumped to the worst possibilities. Was there someone trapped in there? Was the host involved in something sinister? I felt completely alone. Panic took over, and I found myself standing in front of the door in the middle of the night, staring at it, debating whether to break in, but I was too scared of what I might find. I backed away, my hands shaking. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I grabbed a heavy object from the living room and smashed it against the lock. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced the door open, half expecting something to jump out at me. But inside, there was nothing. Just old furniture, dusty boxes, and broken appliances stacked haphazardly. The air in the room felt stale, and the space was suffocating. I stood there, feeling foolish. All that fear, and it was just a storage room. I laughed at myself, a nervous, shaky laugh, as I realized the noises were probably just the plumbing after all. The old pipes must have echoed through the house, making it sound like something was inside. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Then, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, my heart lurching in my chest. I ran to the door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, yelling, though I knew no one could hear me. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open on its own. I bolted out of the room, my mind spinning. What the hell just happened? The next morning, I packed up and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. As I drove away, I tried to rationalize everything. It had to be the old house messing with my head, combined with the stress from the breakup. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. That feeling of being watched, the door slamming shut on its own. It stayed with me. Just as I was about to put it all behind me, I got a message from the host. It was short, but it sent chills down my spine. I told you not to go in there. I still don't know what to believe. Maybe it was all in my head, or maybe there was something in that room after all. The perfect stranger. I live in a small city, nothing special. I work a 9-to-5 office job and my life is pretty routine. I grab coffee from the same cafe every morning, head to work, and hit the gym before going home to my little apartment. It's a quiet life, and I like it that way. I live alone, but I never felt unsafe. The neighborhood's decent, and everyone mostly keeps to themselves. One evening, after a stressful day, I decided to take a walk through the park. The air was cool, and it helped me clear my mind. As I was walking, a man bumped into me. He was tall, with a friendly smile, and we started chatting. His charm put me at ease, and our conversation flowed easily. But there was something strange. He knew my name before I introduced myself. I figured I must have mentioned it without realizing. Still, the way he looked at me when we parted left me feeling uneasy. As I walked home, I felt his eyes on me, like he was still watching. That night, I checked my apartment lock twice, something I'd never done before. Over the next few days, I started seeing him everywhere. First, it was small things. He showed up at the cafe I go to, sitting just a few tables away. He smiled and nodded like he was just another familiar face. I shrugged it off. People run into each other all the time, right? Then, I saw him again at the grocery store. He was grabbing milk just as I reached for cereal. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just another coincidence. But it didn't stop there. One evening, while I was jogging at the gym, I saw him standing at the window, staring at me. My heart jumped into my throat. I tried to focus on my run, but my mind was racing. Was he following me? Am I being paranoid? When I told my friend about it, she laughed and said it was probably nothing. Maybe he has the same routine, she suggested. But the next day I saw him again, this time across the street while I was walking home. He waved at me like we were friends. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. He crossed the street and started chatting as if we'd known each other for years. Then, he started talking about things he shouldn't know. He mentioned my brother, where I grew up. My stomach twisted. I laughed awkwardly, trying to play it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. See you tomorrow. It got worse. No matter where I went, he was there. He was never too close, but always close enough. I changed my routines, different routes to work, different cafes, but somehow he always found me. His presence crept into my thoughts, my dreams. I felt like he was watching me even when I was alone in my apartment. One evening, I looked out my window and saw him standing on the street, looking up at my apartment. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless. What could I say? He hadn't done anything. He was just there. I tried talking to my coworkers about it, but they brushed it off. He's probably just a guy with a crush, they said. But I knew it was more than that. I felt his eyes on me all the time. One morning, I found a note tucked under my car's windshield wiper. I liked the blue dress you wore yesterday, it said, but I hadn't worn a blue dress in weeks. My skin crawled. How long had he been watching me without me noticing? I blocked his number, but the texts kept coming from different numbers. My anxiety was through the roof. I wasn't sleeping anymore, jumping at every little sound. I was sure he had somehow found a way into my building. The next morning at work, I found another note on my desk. I know where you work. That day I broke down in the office bathroom. I was losing it. I didn't know what was real anymore, but I couldn't deny that he had been inside my office. How else could the note have ended up on my desk? I begged my boss for help, but they dismissed me. There was no proof, nothing tangible. He hadn't made any threats. It was all in my head, they said. That evening, I stayed late at the office, too afraid to go home. When I finally left, the street was deserted. I stepped outside, and there he was. He smiled like we were old friends, his face calm, too calm. My stomach dropped. This was no coincidence anymore. I didn't think. I just ran. My heart pounded in my ears as I sprinted down the empty street. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him, but his breath was right behind me. Just as I reached a busier street, I ran into a convenience store, panting. The clerk stared at me, but I didn't care. I hid in the back, hoping he would leave. After a few minutes, I peeked through the window. He was standing across the street, smiling. The clerk offered to call the police, but when I looked again, he was gone. I didn't go home that night. I stayed with a friend for a few days, terrified of returning to my apartment. Every shadow, every sound felt like him. My life was falling apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I filed a police report, but they didn't take it seriously. Just empty promises to look into it. I changed my number, stopped going to my usual places, tried to rebuild some sense of safety. But the fear never really left me. Every time I stepped outside, I felt him, just out of sight, watching. A few days later, I opened my mailbox to find a single piece of folded paper. Miss me? I moved. I had to. I found a new apartment far away, hoping I could finally be safe. For a while, it worked. The paranoia faded, and I started to feel normal again, but it never really went away. Every time I leave my apartment, I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. I check the locks on my doors constantly, and every knock makes my heart stop. Deep down, I know the truth. He's still out there, and I'll never be truly safe. I just hope he never finds me. The new roommate. I wasn't new to living with strangers. Moving to a new city for my job meant hopping between roommates, mostly people I found online. When I came across Rachel's post on a roommate site, she seemed like the perfect fit. She had a steady job, a clean apartment, and liked to keep to herself. Her photos showed a well-maintained place, and we hit it off in our first chat. I moved in a week later. At first, everything went smoothly. We had our own schedules, mostly kept to ourselves, and there was no tension or weirdness. But after a few weeks, small things started to bother me. I'd come home from work and notice my things had been moved. Nothing major, just little shifts like my hairbrush not in the drawer or a book left open when I clearly remembered closing it. I brushed it off as me being tired or forgetful, but it kept happening, little by little. One evening, I noticed a distinct creak in the floorboards, as if someone had been pacing outside my room while I slept. That was the first time I really felt something was off. The first real scare came late one night. I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, when I heard a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Rachel standing there, staring at me with a blank expression. "You're using my toothpaste," she said, her voice calm but cold. Confused, I shook my head. "No, I have my own," I said, pointing to the tube on the counter. But she insisted, stepping into my room uninvited, her eyes locked onto the small tube of toothpaste on my shelf. "That's mine. You moved it." I tried to laugh it off, but she didn't react. She stood there for a moment longer before quietly leaving the room. After that, things shifted. I started locking my door at night. Every sound, every creak made me tense. The feeling that Rachel was watching me, or worse, messing with my things, became overwhelming. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my toothbrush missing. I searched everywhere but couldn't find it. Rachel was already gone for work, so I shrugged it off as another one of her weird quirks. I bought a new one. But when it happened again a few days later, I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was coming into my room while I slept. I confronted her. I tried to stay calm, to handle it like an adult, but the moment I brought up the missing toothbrush, Rachel's face changed. She didn't deny it, didn't get angry. She just stared at me, unblinking. "You're imagining things," she said flatly. I backed off, feeling stupid for even bringing it up, but my paranoia grew. I started noticing other strange things. Clothes from my laundry that weren't mine, the scent of Rachel's perfume on my pillow, subtle changes in the way my room was arranged when I came back home. One night, I couldn't sleep. I was lying in bed when I heard the soft click of my door handle turning. My heart raced. I watched in silent horror as the door slowly cracked open, just enough for someone to peer through. I couldn't see her, but I knew it was Rachel. My breath caught in my throat as I lay frozen in bed, too scared to move. The door stayed slightly ajar for what felt like hours. Then, just as slowly, it closed again. The next day, I tried to find another place to stay. But apartments were hard to come by in this part of the city, and my options were limited. I convinced myself I could handle it for a little longer. A few days later, I came home from work to find Rachel sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. She didn't move when I walked in, didn't say anything. It was unnerving, but I pretended not to notice and hurried to my room. When I opened the door, I was hit with the unmistakable scent of Rachel's perfume again, stronger this time, like she had just been in there. And then I saw it. My pillow, covered in strands of her hair. I panicked. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call a friend, anyone who could help, but Rachel was suddenly there, standing in my doorway. "You're scared of me, aren't you?" Her voice was eerily calm. I didn't answer. My heart pounded, and I could feel my throat tighten. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "You've been spying on me," she accused, her tone darker now, more threatening. "You think you know what's going on, but you don't." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Rachel, I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" she snapped. "That you've been invading my space, touching my things?" I was too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. She leaned in close, whispering, "You shouldn't have moved in here. You shouldn't have gotten close." Without warning, she lunged. I bolted past her, barely making it out of the room. I ran into the kitchen, grabbing the first thing I could, an old frying pan. My hands shook as I held it in front of me like a shield. Rachel stood in the hallway, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. But she didn't come closer. Instead, she smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. "This isn't over," she said softly, before turning and walking back into her room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the living room with my phone in hand, ready to call the police. But what could I say? She hadn't actually done anything illegal. At least nothing I could prove. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother telling her I was moving out. I stayed with a friend until I found another place. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that Rachel is still watching me, waiting for the right moment. It's been months since I left, but I still have nightmares about that night, about the way she looked at me. Sometimes, I wake up to the sound of my door creaking open, even though I know I live alone. I checked the roommate site the other day, out of curiosity. Rachel's profile is still there, with a new ad looking for another roommate. I wonder if they'll notice their things disappearing too. The double date. So, I'm not really one to post on here, but this is still messing with my head, and I haven't been able to shake it. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Anyway, this happened about a month ago, and it's been on my mind ever since. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly happened. My partner and I had recently decided to be more social. We're both introverted by nature, and after the pandemic, we'd gotten used to just sticking to ourselves. But we figured, why not meet new people? So, we signed up on one of those apps that connects couples with other couples for double dates. Nothing sketchy, just friends. That's how we met Sarah and James. Their profiles seem normal, like us. They liked the same movies, restaurants, and had similar interests. After messaging back and forth for a couple of weeks, we agreed to meet up for dinner. We didn't really think much of it. They seemed nice enough. I'll admit, I had this little feeling of unease before we met, but I chalked it up to nerves. New people, right? Dinner started out fine. We met at this trendy little restaurant downtown. Sarah and James were polite, friendly, and very talkative. Almost too talkative. But it was the kind of friendly that felt a little rehearsed. At first, it was great. They asked us about our favorite places to travel, what we did for work, usual small talk stuff. But then it got weird. They knew things, little details that we hadn't told them. Like, James knew exactly what my favorite drink was before I even ordered it. Sarah mentioned a weekend trip we'd taken, a small getaway, something we'd only posted in a private story online. We hadn't shared any of that with them. My partner and I exchanged a look, but we didn't say anything. I figured it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were just really good at picking up on cues. But by the end of dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At one point, James made a joke about knowing where we lived in this overly casual way, and it didn't sit right with me. My partner laughed it off, but I could tell they felt the same. What's worse, when the bill came and we got up to leave, I noticed their car was parked way further down the street. There had been plenty of parking closer to the restaurant, so why park all the way down there? It didn't make sense, but again, we brushed it off. After dinner, they suggested we hit up a bar nearby. I was ready to call it a night, but my partner, always the polite one, agreed. So, we went along. That's when things really started to unravel. The bar they suggested was somewhere I'd never heard of before, even though we knew this area pretty well. It was dimly lit, almost empty, and the whole place felt off. We sat down, and Sarah and James became different, less friendly, more insistent. They pushed us to drink more, kept ordering rounds even though we said we were fine. Sarah kept invading my personal space, leaning in too close, staring just a little too long when I spoke. It was subtle, but it felt like they were playing some kind of game with us. By now, my phone battery was running low, so I got up to ask the bartender for a charger. Sarah piped up before I could even open my mouth. "I knew your phone would die," she said with this creepy smile. It felt like a throwaway comment, but the way she said it, it felt planned, like she'd been waiting for it. I tried to text a friend to get us out of there, but every time I reached for my phone, James would distract me, or Sarah would ask some bizarre question. They were always talking, keeping us from leaving, subtly blocking any attempt to excuse ourselves. At some point, my partner leaned in and whispered, "We need to go." Their face was pale, and I could see the fear in their eyes. That's when I realized none of this was normal. We'd been led here, isolated. My phone died, and suddenly, it felt like I was suffocating. I had no way to call for help, and I had no idea where we were. I stood up, dragging my partner with me. "We're leaving," I said, trying to stay calm. But when we headed for the door, James stepped in front of us. "Just one more drink," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. My heart raced, but I wasn't about to stay. We pushed past him, and I could feel their eyes burning into our backs as we hurried out of the bar. Once we were outside, the street was eerily quiet. I fumbled for my partner's phone and ordered an Uber. We stood there in silence, just waiting, hearts pounding. When the car finally arrived, I glanced back, and there they were. Sarah and James stood at the edge of the street, watching us, completely calm, like they'd expected this. Their faces were so expressionless, it sent chills down my spine. We got home safely, but the feeling of dread didn't go away. I couldn't sleep that night. I checked the locks 3 times, made sure every window was shut. My partner did the same. We didn't talk about what happened until the next morning, but we were both shaken. I tried looking them up online the next day, but their profiles were gone. No trace of them. It was like they'd never existed. My partner suggested we report it to the police, but what could we even say? They didn't do anything illegal. It wasn't like they chased us or attacked us. Still, I can't shake the feeling that we were in real danger. Just when I thought I could finally put it behind me, I got a notification last night. A new follower on one of my social media accounts. No name, just a blank profile. And the message, "We'll see you again soon." So yeah, that's where I'm at. We haven't gone on another double date since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Is this just paranoia, or was there something more sinister going on? I guess I'll never really know. The creeping doubt. I'm not the type of person who scares easily. I live in a small town where not much happens and life is pretty routine. I work as a freelance writer, mostly from home, but every now and then I like to visit the local library to change things up. It's quiet, with just a few regulars, people who mind their own business, like me. We nod as we pass each other, and that's about it. No small talk. One afternoon, after finishing up some work, I decided to browse through the shelves. That's when I found an old leather-bound journal tucked between some reference books. There was no title, just plain brown leather. Curious, I opened it. The first few pages were normal, typical diary stuff about everyday life. Then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. One of the entries mentioned the coffee shop I visit. It described the exact table I sat at last Friday, the same drink I ordered, and even the book I was reading. At first, I shrugged it off as a weird coincidence. But deep down, something didn't feel right. That was just the beginning. I couldn't get the journal out of my head. I wasn't mentioned by name, but the details were too specific. It bugged me enough to go back to the library the next day. I found the journal again, and the more I read, the more unsettled I became. The entries described my life, step by step. Leaving the library, heading home, sitting at my desk working on a project, Every single thing I did was in there, written down like someone had been watching me. But who would go through that much trouble? And why? I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I left the journal on the shelf thinking I could forget about it. But as I was walking out, I noticed the woman at the front desk, the one who's always there. She watched me closely, her eyes following me all the way out the door. My mind raced, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. People look at each other all the time in public places. Still, something felt off. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Whether I was at the coffee shop, the library, or even walking down the street, it felt like eyes were on me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just spooked by the journal. Then I went back to the library. I wasn't planning on looking for the journal again. I just needed to clear my mind and get back into my routine. But as soon as I sat down at my usual spot, there it was, right in front of me on the table. No one else had been around when I left the journal behind. No one had touched it. I glanced over at the front desk. The same woman sat there, typing on her computer, not even looking in my direction. But something about the way her fingers moved over the keyboard made my stomach tighten. It felt too calculated, too deliberate. I opened the journal again, and my heart sank. The most recent entry described me walking into the library that very morning. It detailed everything. What I was wearing, right down to the sneakers and hoodie I had thrown on without thinking. There was no way this was a coincidence anymore. Someone was tracking me. My first instinct was to go straight to the front desk and confront the woman. But as I stood up, a wave of panic hit me. What if she wasn't acting alone? What if there were more people watching, and this was all part of something bigger? The library suddenly felt too quiet, like something was lurking just out of sight. I grabbed the journal and rushed out without a word. At home, I couldn't focus on anything. The journal sat on my coffee table, its presence suffocating. I felt like the walls were closing in. Was someone outside my apartment watching me? I double-checked the locks, pulled the blinds closed, and sat in the silence, listening to every creak and whisper from the street below. I needed answers. The next morning, I went back to the library, but this time I didn't go inside right away. I hid behind a row of parked cars, watching from a distance. I wanted to see who opened the library, to figure out if this woman was behind all of it. It didn't take long before I saw her, unlocking the doors and stepping inside. I couldn't wait any longer. I stormed in as soon as the doors opened, journal in hand, and marched straight to the desk. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaky but loud enough to echo in the empty library. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion. "Excuse me?" "This journal," I said, slamming it on the counter. "It's been following my life, every single move. You've been writing it, haven't you?" Her face softened, a mix of confusion and pity. "I'm sorry, but you've got the wrong person. That journal isn't mine. I haven't even seen it in years. It's been buried in the archives." I didn't believe her. But then, she pulled out a clipboard and showed me a list of names. One stood out immediately. Another man's name, someone who used to visit the library frequently. He hadn't been there in weeks. My heart sank. It turns out the journal wasn't about me at all. It belonged to a man who used to come to the library, a man whose daily routine was eerily similar to mine. The woman at the desk explained that she had mistaken me for him when she saw me reading the journal. It was an honest mix-up, nothing more. I wanted to believe her. The logical part of me knew she was telling the truth. But as I left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone anymore. I've stopped going to the library. I try to tell myself that everything was just a coincidence, that the journal was harmless, and that the woman had nothing to do with it. But sometimes, when I'm out walking or sitting at home, I still get that feeling. The sense that someone's watching. Maybe it's all in my head, or maybe it's not. Either way, I can't shake the creeping doubt. The vanishing car. This happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't shake the feeling of unease. It's not the kind of thing you can easily explain to someone without sounding paranoid, but I figured this is the place to share it. For some background, I've been working late-night shifts for years. I always drive home around 1 or 2 a.m., and I've never had an issue. My neighborhood is quiet at night, and honestly, I've always felt safe driving around at those hours. That night felt like any other. The streets were empty, just like always. The air was cool, and I had my windows cracked open slightly to enjoy it. I wasn't really thinking about much, just trying to unwind from work. As usual, I was listening to some music, nothing out of the ordinary, but I noticed the radio started to flicker for a moment, just static for a few seconds before it went back to normal. Weird, but nothing too concerning. Then, I saw it. A car in my rearview mirror. Normally, that wouldn't have bothered me. After all, it's not that strange to see another car, even at 2 a.m. But something about the way it stayed at the same distance from me felt off. I slowed down, thinking they'd pass me, but they didn't. They just stayed there, trailing me at a distance that seemed too calculated. At first, I brushed it off. It's just another driver, I told myself. Maybe they're heading home, just like me. But the longer I drove, the more it stuck with me that they weren't backing off or overtaking me. I decided to turn down a random street, one I don't usually take, just to test the waters. That's when my heart started racing, because they turned too. Now, I was starting to get nervous. I sped up a little, hoping maybe it was all in my head, but the car matched my speed perfectly. It didn't matter if I slowed down or sped up, they stayed right behind me. I felt my pulse quicken, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. What if they were following me on purpose? I started rationalizing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were just lost. Maybe they didn't even realize they were creeping me out. That's when they flashed their headlights at me. Twice. It felt deliberate, like a signal. My stomach dropped, and I knew this wasn't just some random driver. They were sending a message, and I was trapped. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. I kept driving, making random turns, hoping I could lose them, but nothing worked. Every turn I made, they followed. I could feel my breathing getting faster, my heart pounding in my chest. What did they want? Was it just some sick game, or were they planning something worse? I tried to calm down and think logically. Maybe I could stop somewhere public. But it was too late at night. The streets were deserted. I considered pulling over to let them pass, but something about that felt like the wrong move, like I'd be making myself an easy target. So I did the only thing that made sense in the moment. I sped up, hoping to lose them in the maze of empty streets. I pushed my car to the limit, cutting corners, running yellow lights, doing everything I could to get away. But no matter what I did, the car was still there, right behind me. It didn't matter how fast or slow I went, it followed, relentless. I could feel my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. I grabbed my phone and tried to call someone, anyone, but of course there was no signal. Typical. I was starting to lose it. Who was driving this car? Was it some random creep? Or had I unknowingly pissed someone off? The not knowing made it worse. As I sped down a narrow road, I glanced back for what felt like the 100th time, and the headlights suddenly disappeared. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a tiny bit of relief. Maybe I'd finally lost them. But the relief didn't last long. I turned another corner, and there they were again, right behind me, closer this time. I could almost feel them breathing down my neck. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was full-blown terror. They weren't going to stop, and I had no idea what they wanted. My hands were shaking, and my whole body felt cold. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. Desperation took over. I saw a side street up ahead, barely visible in the dark, and I made a sharp turn, hoping the narrowness of the road would make it hard for them to follow. For a moment, everything went silent. I looked back, and there was nothing. The car was gone, completely vanished. The street was empty, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. Where had they gone? How could they have disappeared so quickly? I drove home in a daze, still expecting them to show up out of nowhere. Every car I passed made my heart skip a beat. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was shaking. I parked, but I didn't get out right away. I just sat there, staring out into the empty street, waiting for the car to appear again. It didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching. I finally got inside, locking the door behind me and peeking out the window. In the distance, I saw headlights, far enough away that I couldn't tell if it was the same car, but I couldn't relax. I stood there, watching, heart pounding in my chest, waiting for them to come closer. They didn't. Now, weeks later, I still feel paranoid every time I drive home at night. I can't stop checking my mirrors, expecting to see that car again. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Do you think they'll come back? Because I can't help but feel like it's not over yet. That feeling of dread, it never really goes away. The stranger's call. I don't even know why I'm sharing this. Maybe it's to get it out of my system, or maybe I just want someone to tell me I'm not crazy. Either way, I've been thinking about that night for months now, and I still don't feel safe. I'm a 35-year-old woman living alone in a quiet part of town. Nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom apartment. It's peaceful, and I've always felt comfortable there, until recently. For the past few weeks, I'd been hearing odd things at night. Footsteps in the hallway that didn't belong to anyone in my building, or a car that would park outside for hours. I shrugged it off as paranoia at first. I'm a single woman living alone. It's normal to get jumpy, right? But there were other things too. My phone would ring at weird hours, but when I picked up, there'd be no one on the other end, just silence. I convinced myself it was telemarketers or wrong numbers, and I ignored it. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. One night, around 11 p.m., I was winding down, scrolling through my phone when it rang again. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another spam call, but for some reason, I did. A man's voice came through, calm, casual. He said he knew me through a mutual friend, but I couldn't quite place the name he mentioned. I was polite, trying to figure out where we might have crossed paths. The conversation was strange but not alarming at first. Then, things took a turn. He started saying things about me, things he shouldn't have known. He knew my job, the building I lived in, even what I had been wearing that day. The more he talked, the more uneasy I felt. My responses got shorter, and I tried to find a way to end the call without sounding rude. But before I could hang up, he said something that sent chills down my spine. "You're closer to me than you think." I froze. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing and my throat felt tight. Without another word, he hung up, leaving me sitting there in silence. My apartment, once so familiar and safe, suddenly felt different, like I wasn't alone. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, trying to calm down, but my mind kept racing. How did he know all those details? Who was he? I started thinking about all the strange things I'd noticed lately. The footsteps, the car parked outside, the hang-up calls. Could it all be connected? I decided to call a close friend of mine. She told me I was overreacting, that it was probably just some creep who got my number from social media or something. I wanted to believe her, but the unease wouldn't go away. I stayed up late that night, jumping at every little sound. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I managed to fall asleep. The next night, around the same time, my phone rang again. It was the same number. My stomach sank. I didn't answer, but the ringing wouldn't stop. It went on and on, filling the silence of my apartment. And then, after what felt like hours, it stopped. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief. But then there was a knock at my door. My heart nearly stopped. I crept to the peephole and looked out. There was no one there. I waited, holding my breath, hoping that whoever it was had gone away, but the tension wouldn't leave. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but my fingers were shaking so badly I could barely dial. Suddenly, a text message came through. It was from the same number. "Open the door, Sarah." I felt my blood run cold. How did he know my name? How did he know I was home? Panic set in. I rushed to the windows, peering out into the street, but I couldn't see anyone. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I checked the peephole again, and this time there was someone there. A man, wearing a dark hoodie, stood motionless in front of my door. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. I stifled a scream and backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to stay calm, hoping he would leave if I stayed quiet. But then, another knock, slow, deliberate. Another text followed. "I know you're in there." I felt trapped. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Run out the back? My thoughts were jumbled and I was too scared to move. I looked around for something, anything to defend myself, and my eyes landed on a kitchen knife. I grabbed it, my hand shaking as I held it close. Then I heard it, the sound of a key turning in the lock. My blood turned to ice. No one had a key to my apartment. I hadn't given one to anyone. How was this even possible? The door creaked open. I backed up against the wall, clutching the knife like it was my only lifeline. My mind was racing. Should I run? Fight? Hide? But there was no time to decide. The door swung open slowly, and I stared into the darkness beyond. For a second, nothing happened. I almost thought I was imagining it, that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps entering my apartment. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were there. The footsteps stopped, and the apartment fell into silence again. My grip on the knife tightened, but it felt useless in my hands. I was too terrified to move, too scared to even breathe. Then my phone buzzed one last time. Another text. Too late. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The misdirected mail. I've always lived a quiet life. I'm in my late 30s, single, and work from home in a small suburban neighborhood. My days follow a predictable routine, which I like. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, get through the day, and repeat. I enjoy the peace and quiet. My social life isn't much, but I never needed much excitement. A few months ago, something odd started happening. I began receiving mail that wasn't mine. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a few letters addressed to different names but with my house number on them. I figured it was a simple mistake. People move in and out all the time, and the mail system messes up occasionally, right? I tossed the letters aside and forgot about them. But then it kept happening. Every few days, more envelopes appeared, some with no return address at all. The handwriting was messy, like someone wasn't even trying to make it legible. The names varied, none of them familiar. Still, I didn't feel concerned. I just assumed it would stop eventually. Until the day I received a small package. This time, it was addressed to me. I was confused because I hadn't ordered anything. Inside was a keychain, a cheap plastic one that I'd lost years ago. How did they have this? I started to feel a knot in my stomach, but I still tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe it had turned up at a lost and found, and somehow it made its way back to me. That happens, right? After that package, the the mail situation got worse. Not only were the letters still coming, but the packages became more personal. One contained a photograph of my street, taken from an angle that could only mean someone had been standing right outside my house. Another package held a receipt from a cafe I visit regularly. I remember glancing around the cafe a few weeks back, wondering if someone was staring at me. Now, I wasn't so sure I was just being paranoid. One package had a single glove in it, my glove. I'd lost it during a walk a few weeks earlier and never thought much about it. How did it end up in my mailbox? I started feeling uneasy. Was someone messing with me? At first, I didn't want to tell anyone. I figured I was overthinking things. But one night, I heard a knock at my door around midnight. I rushed to answer it, but no one was there. Just an envelope sitting on the doorstep. Inside was another picture of my street, but this time it was closer. Like whoever took it had moved in toward my house. I had to do something. So I bought a small camera and set it up near the door to catch whoever was leaving the packages. The next day, I reviewed the footage, my heart racing as I fast-forwarded through the night. For hours, there was nothing, just the usual dark street. Then, around 3 a.m., I saw it, a figure, standing just outside the camera's range, not moving, just watching my house. They stayed there for almost 2 hours and then disappeared without ever coming closer. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried contacting the Postal Service, thinking maybe they could trace where the packages were coming from. They assured me everything was processed normally and suggested I might be the victim of a prank. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt personal. I went to the police next, but they weren't any help either. They shrugged it off, saying it could be some kids messing around or a clerical mix-up. A few days later, I found a package inside my mailbox. This time, it was worse. Inside was a photograph of me, asleep in my own bed. Someone had been inside my house. My blood ran cold as I realized the depth of what was happening. I immediately changed the locks and installed more cameras, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The packages kept coming, no matter what I did. One of the last packages I received had a note in it. The handwriting was mine. It read, "You know why." I stared at the note for hours, trying to figure out what it meant. Did I do something? Did someone think I had wronged them? I had no answers, but the fear was constant now. I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the house made me jump. I felt watched, constantly. I decided I had no choice but to leave. I moved halfway across the country, far from that neighborhood. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I rented a small apartment, trying to convince myself that I'd be safe in a new place. For the first few days, I felt a sense of relief. It was over. I was free from whatever or whoever was targeting me. But that didn't last. On my first morning in the new apartment, I checked the mailbox. There was an envelope, no return address, just like before. Inside was another photograph of me. This time, it was a photo of me sleeping in my new apartment. My stomach dropped. I wanted to throw up. How had they found me so quickly? Along with the photograph, there was a note. It was short, just 2 words. You can't hide. Since then, I've barely left my apartment. I keep all the curtains drawn and avoid contact with anyone. I feel like I'm being watched all the time. Every creak in the building makes my heart race. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to do anything that might give away where I am. The packages haven't stopped. In fact, they've started arriving more frequently. One was left inside my apartment even though I'd changed the locks and added security cameras. It was a small, plain envelope. Inside was a key, the key to my apartment. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I've reached out for help, but no one believes me. No one thinks this is real, but I know it is. Someone is watching me. Someone knows everything about me. There's knocking at my door as I'm typing this. I know better than to answer. but I think they're inside. The empty cabin. I never thought I'd be the type of guy to post on here, but what happened to me and my girlfriend Sarah last weekend still has me on edge. I'm hoping someone here can offer some kind of explanation or at least tell me I'm not going crazy. We both live pretty stressful lives, working long hours in the city, so when Sarah suggested we rent a remote cabin for the weekend, I was all for it. A few days of quiet sounded perfect. The cabin we found was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods. It was exactly what we were looking for, completely isolated, peaceful, and far from any distractions. But from the moment we got there, something felt off. Maybe it was the silence. It was too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. The first night, I heard a branch snap outside, closer than I'd have liked, but I told myself it was just some animal. The next morning, a bird flew straight into one of the windows, which startled us both, but again, I didn't think much of it. What really started to worry me was when Sarah pointed out that the door to the cabin had been unlocked when we arrived. I brushed it off, assuming the cleaning crew forgot to lock it. Still, something about it felt wrong. The real unease started later that morning. I noticed a pair of muddy footprints near the back door. At first, I figured they were animal tracks, but the size, they were large, too large for most animals. I tried not to worry Sarah, so I didn't mention it. After a day spent hiking, we returned to the cabin as the sun started to set. I don't know how to explain it, but the whole atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, and the cabin, which seemed cozy before, now felt claustrophobic. Sarah went inside to start making dinner, and I stepped out to grab some firewood. That's when I saw more footprints. These weren't like the ones I saw earlier. They were fresh, and they led into the woods. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't want to scare Sarah. I went back inside and tried to act like everything was normal. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but it didn't help. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind, but then I started hearing faint rustling outside, closer and more deliberate. Sarah woke up and asked if I heard it too. I lied and said it was probably just the wind. We both lay there in the dark waiting for the noise to stop. It never did. The next morning, things got worse. We found our garbage bin had been moved. It was lying on its side, but that wasn't the worst part. There were muddy handprints on the cabin door. Not animal prints, human handprints. That's when the fear really set in. I could tell Sarah was scared, and I tried to stay calm for her, but I couldn't stop thinking about who could have done this. We tried to call the cabin owner, but we had no cell service. The nearest town was a half-hour drive away, and there was no landline. We locked all the doors and windows, deciding to stay inside for the rest of the day. Sarah took a nap while I went outside, needing to see if there were more tracks or any sign of someone else around. I found footprints leading deeper into the woods. As I followed them, I started to panic, thinking about all the possibilities. Was it some hunter? A drifter? Someone dangerous? Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. My heart raced as I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I didn't tell Sarah what I'd seen. She was already on edge, and I didn't want to make things worse. That night, the noises outside returned. They weren't faint this time. They were closer, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. Sarah was terrified, begging me to check, but I refused. We sat in silence, listening, hearts pounding. And then, knock, knock, knock. Slow and deliberate, right at the front door. I grabbed a kitchen knife, and Sarah hid in the bedroom. My heart felt like it was about to explode as I crept toward the door. I told myself it could be anything, maybe a lost hiker, maybe some animal, but the knock came again, 3 times. I peered through the window, but no one was there. I opened the door slowly, knife in hand, but the porch was empty. The only thing I saw was more muddy footprints leading back into the woods. Was someone messing with us? I felt like I was losing it, questioning everything. Just as I was about to shut the door, Sarah screamed from the bedroom. I rushed in to find her pointing out the window. Through the trees, barely visible in the fading light, was the shadow of a person, standing still, watching us. We both stared, frozen in fear, until the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, we couldn't leave fast enough. We packed up in silence, the tension between us unbearable. Just before we left, I noticed something strange. The handprints on the door were gone, wiped away like someone had been back to cover their tracks. As we drove away, neither of us spoke. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. We passed a small roadside stand with an old man sitting nearby. I slowed down and asked if he'd seen anyone wandering around the woods recently. He just shook his head and said, "You're not the first to ask." As we drove off, Sarah quietly mentioned she saw fresh footprints next to the car that morning, larger than the ones before. Back in the city, I try to forget, but I can't. I check the locks constantly, and every little noise makes me jump. Sarah refuses to talk about it, and she's made it clear she's never going camping again. We never found out who was out there. I sometimes wonder if they followed us back. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I don't usually share my personal stories online, but what happened to me has been weighing on my mind, and I need to get it out there. Maybe it'll help me make sense of it. This all started about 2 months ago, when I decided to give online dating another shot. I'm not the type to go out much. I live alone, work your typical 9-to-5 office job, and most of my social life happens online. I've been feeling pretty lonely though, so I figured, why not? I met this girl, Sarah. She was quiet but kind, a bit like me, I guess. We talked for a couple of weeks, just basic stuff. Movies, music, what we did for work. Nothing felt off at first, but looking back now, I realized she always dodged video calls. She had excuses, bad lighting, not being camera ready, so I didn't push it. Eventually, we agreed to meet up for coffee at this little cafe downtown. I was excited, but also nervous. Meeting people from the internet in real life always felt a bit strange to me. Still, I thought Sarah was worth it. The day came, and I showed up at the cafe right on time. I got a table near the window and waited. After 15 minutes, I started checking my phone. No messages from her. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. I sent her a couple of texts, asking if everything was okay. Still nothing. I figured maybe she'd gotten cold feet or something had come up. I waited a little longer, then left. I wasn't too upset at first. Stuff happens, right? But the next few days were weird. I couldn't reach her at all. Her profile on the app was gone, just like that, and she wasn't responding to any of my messages. I tried not to think too much about it, but something about the whole thing bothered me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, I started noticing this man. I don't know if it was coincidence or what, but I kept seeing the same guy near my building. At first, it was just in passing. I'd be walking home, and he'd be there, across the street, watching. I figured it was just someone from the neighborhood, but then I started seeing him everywhere, when I went to the grocery store, on my way to work, even outside the cafe where I was supposed to meet Sarah. He never approached me, never said a word, but I could feel his eyes on me, every time. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. I told a friend about it and they laughed it off. "You're just imagining things," they said. It's probably some guy who works nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I tried to change up my routine, walking different routes to work, going to different shops, but no matter where I went, there he was, always in the background, always watching. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was growing. I felt like I was being hunted, like he was waiting for the right moment to do something. But what? Then one night I came home after a late shift and my front door was ajar. I froze. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. My heart was pounding as I slowly pushed the door open, gripping my keys like a weapon. The apartment was quiet. Everything seemed in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. I told myself it must have been a mistake, that maybe I'd forgotten to lock it. But from that night on, I couldn't sleep. The next few days were hell. I kept seeing the man, and now I couldn't escape the feeling that he had been inside my home. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a creak from the living room. It was so faint I almost missed it, but then I heard it again, like someone walking around. I grabbed the kitchen knife from my nightstand. Yeah, I started keeping one there, heart racing, and crept out to the living room. No one was there, but the window was wide open. I know I closed it earlier. I was losing my mind, or so I thought until I got a message from Sarah. After all this time, her name popped up on my phone, but it wasn't the friendly, casual tone I remembered. The message was brief, just 3 words. Be careful, he's watching. Panic flooded through me. How did she know? What did she mean? Before I could even process it, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, clutching the knife, as they got closer and closer, then stopped right in front of my door. I thought for sure it was him, that he was finally going to come for me. But after a few minutes of silence, the footsteps retreated. I called the police. When they arrived, there was no one outside, no sign of forced entry, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I know what I heard. I know someone was there. They told me to lock my doors, be cautious, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. After they left, I stayed up the rest of the night, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed. Nothing. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. He's closer than you think. That was 2 days ago, and I haven't left my apartment since. I keep checking the locks, peeking through the blinds, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I don't know what to believe anymore. Did I ever even meet Sarah? Was she real? Or was she just a way to get to me, to lure me into this nightmare? I don't know what's coming next, but every time I close my eyes, I can feel him getting closer. Story 24, The False Rescue. I never thought I'd be one of those people. You know, the ones who share their stories on Reddit hoping someone will believe them. But after what happened to me, I just need to get it off my chest. This happened a few weeks ago and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I was driving back from a weekend trip. It was a standard getaway. The weather was perfect and traffic was light. I had about 2 hours left when my car started acting up. At first, it was just a small shudder. I didn't think much of it. But then the engine light came on, and before I knew it, my car completely stopped. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere on a highway that seemed to stretch forever. The last gas station I saw was miles back, and my phone barely had a signal. I tried calling for roadside assistance, but the call kept dropping. I sat there, hoping someone would pass by soon. After about 15 minutes, I saw an old, beat-up pickup truck driving by. The driver slowed down and pulled over just ahead of me. He got out and started walking toward my car, waving. Relief washed over me. I was about to meet the man who would save the day, or so I thought. He looked like he was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a weathered face that suggested he spent a lot of time outdoors. Nothing about him seemed odd at first, just a regular guy wearing a flannel shirt and worn-out jeans. He smiled and came up to my window, and I rolled it down a bit to hear him. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was rough but friendly. I nodded and told him what had happened. He took a quick look under the hood, poked around a bit, and then shrugged. "Looks like it's something I can't fix here," he said. "But I know a place about 10 minutes up the road. They've got a tow truck. I can give you a ride there if you want." Something about his offer didn't sit right with me. I couldn't pinpoint why, but his casual tone, the way he said it, felt too rehearsed. But my phone wasn't working, and I didn't know when the next car might pass. So I hesitated. "I think I'll just wait here for roadside assistance," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. "Nah," he insisted. "You'll be waiting all day out here. Come on, I don't mind helping." The more he pushed, the more uncomfortable I felt. He wasn't being aggressive, but my instincts were telling me to stay put. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever. Eventually, I gave in. "All right, let me grab my bag," I said, stepping out of the car. But as soon as I did, he made a comment that sent chills down my spine. "You really shouldn't be out here all alone," he said, his eyes narrowing. Anything could happen. I immediately regretted stepping out of my car. A knot formed in my stomach, and I realized how isolated I was. I tried to stay calm and made up an excuse. "Actually, I think I'll wait after all," I said, trying to sound casual. I opened my car door again, hoping he'd leave it at that, but his face changed. His smile faded, and his voice dropped. "It's really not safe here," he said, more quietly this time, but the tone was different, darker. "Come on, it's just up the road." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. There were no cars, no houses, nothing but open fields around us. The road was empty, and it was just the two of us. I backed up toward my car, my hands trembling. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll wait." He took a step closer. "You can't just stay here." His tone wasn't friendly anymore. I wasn't sure if it was a threat, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I quickly got back into my car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, praying the engine would start. Nothing. The car wouldn't even turn over. The man stood there, watching me through the windshield. He didn't move, just stood still, eyes following my every move. He didn't look angry or upset, just patient, like he was waiting for something. Panic took over. I grabbed my DP phone even though I knew there was no signal. I held it up to my ear, pretending to talk to someone. I thought maybe that would make him leave, but he didn't budge. "I told you, you're not going anywhere without help," he said, loud enough for me to hear through the glass. This time, he was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. My heart raced. I scanned the road. Still no cars. No one was coming. I was trapped. I watched him as he started walking back toward his truck. I didn't wait to see what he was doing. Without thinking, I opened my door quietly and slipped out. I stayed low, moving around the back of my car, heading toward the field. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. I heard his truck door open and close, and then footsteps getting closer. I ran. I didn't stop running until my legs felt like they were on fire. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get away. Eventually, I looked back, and there he was, standing by his truck, watching me. He didn't follow, didn't run after me. He just stood there. It took hours, but I eventually found a small town. I used a payphone to call the police. By the time they got to the highway, the man and his truck were gone. They found my car, but no sign of him. To this day, I don't know what his real intentions were. Maybe he was trying to help, and I overreacted. But deep down, I know I didn't. Sometimes, late at night, I lie awake wondering how close I came to something much worse. Something I'll never fully understand.